I found out my wife, Rhonda, was cheating on me 2 years ago. After a heated argument over this, I packed up my belongings and moved out. Naturally, I wasn't moving out because of the argument, rather, I was moving out because I couldn't live with a cheating woman. The moment she led another man into her underwear, our marriage was over. I made a reservation at a motel close to work. Though a little shady, it would do until I discovered something more reliable. I packed my 2 suitcases into my room and set out to find a local bar nearby with the intention of getting wasted and forgetting my troubles. I wouldn't risk a DWI by walking. Due in large part to the weeknight, the location I selected was essentially deserted. 2 couples occupied tables, while an elderly man sat at the bar sipping from a bottle of beer. I discovered a booth farthest from other people on the wall. I was not feeling like having a conversation. Looking bored, the waitress came over and I placed my order for a beer and a shot of Jack. I had enough time to think a little by the time my second round was over. I came to the realization that I had 2 options: either I could wallow in my self-pity or I could carry on as usual and tackle this issue head-on. It was the height of the housing boom, and I was a spec builder, creating luxurious homes. I would always have 2 or 3 houses under construction at any given time, and I discovered that if I put off fixing construction-related issues, I would have to pay the price. Resolved, I went back to the motel and slept through a restless night. To protect myself, I went to the bank the following morning and transferred all of our funds from our joint accounts into one that was solely in my name. I then cancelled all of our joint credit cards, keeping only the 2 I had created for my business and the one in my name alone. I went to my lawyer at the end of the day to get divorce papers prepared. In addition to being my attorney, Keith was a friend of mine. While he focused on real estate law, Shelley, his partner and fellow lawyer, handled family law cases. They both apologized to me for the situation I was in, and then we sat down to discuss the specifics. The standard lineup was delivered to me, explaining that since this was a community property state, she would be entitled to half of everything and that I would have to pay child support. I informed them that, while I was well aware of that, I had made up my mind to move forward with the paperwork. I filed for dissolution rather than adultery because of our daughter and irreconcilable differences. I'd done well in business, and I'd still be in good shape even if I had to give her half. All I wanted was to get rid of a disloyal wife. Knowing that I was now in control of the situation helped me sleep better that night. My 13-year-old daughter, Katie, called me on Friday night, the second full day after I had packed my bags and left. She informed me that she was hungry and alone, and that she had not seen or heard from her mother since returning from school. I got into my truck and drove home, cursing my soon-to-be ex. After comforting my upset daughter, I went to the kitchen to prepare her some food. I noticed an envelope with my name in my wife's handwriting underneath a magnet on the fridge. Despite my curiosity to discover what was inside, I threw it onto the counter to read at a later time and carried on preparing Katie's dinner. I didn't go back to the kitchen until after we had eaten, watched a little TV, and I had put Katie to bed. After taking up the envelope, I entered the den. I filled my glass with a shot of bourbon, took a seat, and started reading whatever was inside. My wife had written me a note, telling me that I was crazy to think I would leave her with a child to raise. It continued, telling me not to bother looking for her as she was leaving. It would be an understatement to say I was stunned. It dawned on me that I had never truly known the woman I had married. I simply could not comprehend how a mother could possibly forsake her child. When I walked up to our former bedroom, I noticed that the majority of her clothes and personal belongings were missing. To discuss this new development and find out how it would impact my attempt to file for divorce from my wife, I decided to wait until the following morning to give Keith and Shelley a call. Shelley told me to hold off until Monday, when she would go with me to my wife's office. We could serve her there once she drew up the divorce paperwork. Having a conversation with Katie about the situation was the most difficult thing to do. Since I hadn't been home for the previous 2 nights, she was already aware that her mother and I were experiencing difficulties. I told her that her mother had left a note stating that she was leaving, deciding that it would be best to be honest with her. Other than that, I didn't really know myself, so I couldn't really respond to her inquiries about when she would return. After we made it through the weekend, I gave Katie her breakfast and dropped her off at school on Monday morning. I took a car to my wife's workplace and met Shelley there. We went inside together to see if my wife was there. We were led to the Human Resources Department upon hearing my wife's name, and there we discovered that both she and her supervisor had submitted their resignations the Friday before. I wasn't overly shocked, though, because I had already learned that the man she had been seeing was her boss. Her boss was foolish enough to engage in a sexual relationship with a worker under his supervision, but he was also astute enough to know that if I brought up the matter, he would be fired for violating the company's policy prohibiting manager-employee fraternization. Shelley told me that since she had been gone for more than 48 hours, it would be best for me to report her missing when I got outside in the parking lot. They would have no choice but to accept the report and, fingers crossed, locate her. She went with me to the police station, where I gave my wife's missing wife statement to a detective. Being straight with him, I told him that my goal in finding her was to serve her with divorce papers. I told him what we had discovered about her and her lover quitting their jobs, and I showed him the note she had left. When he inquired about my whereabouts on the Friday that she was last seen, I reassured him that I had spent the entire day at one of the houses I was building, and multiple contractors could vouch for that. Ultimately, the police officer informed me that there wasn't much they could do if they could conclude that there was no criminal activity and she had left on her own initiative. We then called Shelley's husband and arranged to meet at the Olive Garden after I offered to buy her lunch. To be able to talk, we asked to be seated at a fairly private table. "So, Shelley, what does this do as far as the divorce if we can't find her to have her served?" I responded. "What that means in this state is you are going to have to wait for a year before you can file on the grounds of abandonment." "I'm sorry, Steve, but that is what the law states," replied Shelley. "The reason I wanted you to report her missing is so that we have an official report of when she left to document it. Other than that, if the police don't locate her, your only other option if you want to pursue it is to hire a private agency to try to track her down." "Well, I guess that gives me something to think about. I guess I will wait until I hear from the police. Honestly, though, I don't know if I even want to know where she's gone, as I'm in no hurry to get married again, if ever. I guess waiting a year isn't that big of a deal as long as I don't have to deal with her," I replied. I could see the pitying expression in Shelley's eyes when I told her I had no intention of getting married again. She patted my hand as she reached over. "Steve, I know how tough this is on you, and I know you're hurting right now. But as your friend, please promise me that you're not going to cut yourself off from life. For now, my focus is on Katie. I'm sure she is even more shocked and hurt than I am. I have to be there for her." Both Shelley and Keith gave me a nod of understanding and assured me that they would support me in any way they could. I stopped by one of my job sites after lunch to see how things were going, and then I went to Katie's school to wait for her to finish. I watched her scanning the area almost frantically as she left the building, and when she spotted my truck, she came running. As soon as I emerged, she threw herself into my arms. Her trembling was palpable to me. She buried her face in my neck and sniffled, "I was afraid you wouldn't be here." "Oh, darling, I swear I'm staying put," I replied, giving her a firm embrace. She asked, her large blue eyes sparkling with tears, "Do you really promise?" I kissed her forehead, carried her around to the passenger side of the truck, and put on her seatbelt. "Yes, honey, I really promise." As I made my way inside, I cursed my wife once more. On the way home, I finally got Katie to talk about her school day with a little prodding. Katie wouldn't let me leave her sight as soon as we got home. I kept trying my hardest to tell her that I wouldn't leave her behind. She started having nightmares in spite of that, and I would wake up to find her crying in her sleep. When I would wake her up from my mad dash to her room, she would throw her arms around me and cling to me as if she were holding on for dear life. She told me she was lost and couldn't find her mother or me when I asked her what she was dreaming about. During this period, my office manager was my greatest asset. To free me up to focus on the more difficult tasks, I had hired Renee to assist me with the numerous menial aspects of my work, like scheduling inspections and obtaining permits. I had grown to completely rely on her since then. She was now responsible for managing all the required paperwork, ordering and tracking materials, and keeping the subcontractors on schedule. I never worried about going several days without visiting the office because I knew Renee could handle it. She even wrote the checks to pay the vendors or subcontractors because I had so much faith in her. She would see to it that they were delivered. All I had to do was stop by on Friday to sign them. I started interviewing people after deciding I needed assistance running my business and placing an advertisement in the local newspaper. I was losing hope in the responders because I was unable to locate anyone with the credentials I believed were required for the position. That is, until Renee submitted a job application. I can still clearly recall her first entrance. I was married, but I could still tell a pretty woman when I saw one. Standing at a mere 5 feet 4 inches, she had a cute button of a nose, big brown eyes, and, from what I could see, was clearly in her early 30s. She was dressed in a blue business suit that, while not particularly revealing, did little to camouflage her trim figure. Her qualifications impressed me, and the interview went well. She had worked for her father, a construction company owner, so she knew the ropes. When I asked her why she didn't work for him anymore, she told me that they had to move because her husband was transferred here. She also told me that she had a daughter who was the same age as my Katie, and now that she was in school, Renee wanted to go back to work. We worked out a wage agreement, and I had an office manager. Now, don't get the wrong idea, nothing ever happened between the two of us, not even flirting on my part, because I was married and I took my vow seriously. Additionally, she was married and I have a strict rule that I never mess with another man's woman. As for her, she was clearly not the kind of woman to mess around. When I told Renee about my marital problems, she suggested that I send Katie to therapy. I soon realized that she was right, and we worked together to find a therapist who would accept Katie. Katie had always been very shy around men, so I thought that having a woman therapist would help her feel more at ease. I met with Dr. Walters to explain all that had happened and why I thought it was important that she see Katie. We arranged to meet twice a week, and she mentioned that it would be good if I could be there because she would like to see us together sometimes and just Katie by herself other times. A week later, I was asked to come down to the station and meet with the detective I had first spoken with. He informed me that their investigations had tracked her lover's credit card usage to 2 motels, and they had determined with the use of pictures that the two were together of their own free will. They had apparently left the state, and since there was no evidence of foul play, the police were not going to pursue the case. This was another incident that had occurred in the interim. The day after I had filed a missing persons report, the police sent over a woman detective to speak with Katie. My daughter told them that the last time she had seen her mother. For the next 2 months, the therapy seemed to be helping my daughter. The frequency of her nightmares had decreased, and she no longer felt the need to keep me in sight whenever we were together. I think she finally realized that it was not her fault that her mother had left, but more importantly, that I would always be there for her. Renee and her husband began to invite Katie and me to their house for barbecues. At first, I was hesitant to accept, but Renee convinced me that it would be good for Katie to spend time with her daughter doing normal girl things. I knew her husband, James, from having met him at different times, but I was a little concerned how he would take his wife inviting a man, even if it were her boss, into their home. I quickly found that my worries were for nothing. He and I quickly bonded and became friends. My Katie and their daughter, Gina, also quickly bonded and became best friends. Not only that, but Renee, being a loving mother, made sure to spend time with both girls, giving Katie what I felt was much-needed motherly guidance. My wife had been gone for 10 weeks with no word from her, and I decided it was time to rid my bedroom of the last vestiges of her former presence. Although she had apparently packed a lot of her clothes and personal effects, she had still left stuff behind. I brought a couple of large garbage sacks up and started going through her drawers, emptying out her belongings. In the last drawer, which was mostly sweaters, I found a small box tucked into the back. Being curious, I opened it up and gasped when I saw what was inside. There was a baggie with at least 1/4 ounce of pot in it and a vial of white powder. Now, I wasn't naive about drugs. In my younger days before I married Katie's mother, I had done some experimenting myself, but put that aside when I graduated college and got serious about life. I opened the vial and sniffed at it before taking a little powder on my finger and tentatively tasting it. Cocaine. The only other thing in there was a CD. I turned on my computer and put in the disc to see if there was anything on it that I could access. I saw that it contained a movie, so I opened it with the movie player and was surprised to see that it was obviously shot in the basement. I had built the house we lived in and had the basement set up with exercise equipment on one side, and the other was basically a game room with a pool table, plush couches, and a large screen TV. The scene showed for couples sitting or standing, most with drinks in their hands. Two of those people were my wife and her boss. I advanced the movie forward, and at this point, I saw people passing around joints while others were snorting lines of white powder off the glass top of the coffee table. Once again, I forwarded the movie, and this time it showed my wife impaled on a man lying on his back. There was a second man shoved behind her and a third standing to the side near her face. I have always had a strong desire for sex and have even watched some porn when my wife was not amenable to my advances. I know there are men who get off on seeing their wives have sex with other men, but I'm not one of those. All I felt was a great upheaval in my stomach, and I hurried to the bathroom, whereupon my vomit sprayed all over the floor. After emptying my stomach, I sat there in a daze for a while before gathering my courage and heading to grab a mop to clean up the mess. As I was leaving, I noticed that the movie was still playing on my computer, so I quickly shut it down without glancing at the screen. After I had everything cleaned up, I called Shelley. "Hey Shelley, it's Steve. Got time to talk?" "Steve, Keith, and I always have time for you." "What's up?" she replied. "Well, I decided to get rid of some of Rhonda's stuff that is just taking up space, and in one of her drawers, I found a box with drugs and a CD. I was wondering if I should call the police and report the drugs. Honestly, I don't think that would be a good idea. The drugs are in your house, and if it came down to it, it would be your word against hers as to who they belong to. I really think you would be best off getting rid of them." "Wow, I didn't really consider that," I said. "How about the CD? I put it in my computer, and it's a movie of her and her friends doing drugs and having unprotected group sex. That woman had an orgy in my basement." "Oh God, Steve, I'm sorry. I know that you would never have wanted to see that. However, since it was filmed in your home, it could be used as admissible evidence in court, especially if it came down to a matter of custody. I would suggest you hide it somewhere secure in case it's needed." "That's what I was hoping you would say. I intend to try to do anything I can to keep her away from Katie." "So, how are things really going?" James asked me on our fourth visit to their house. The girls were out of earshot, being in the house preparing lunch. "I guess things are as well as could be expected when you find out your wife is a 304 into drugs and group sex," I answered. "What?" James said with a gasp. I went on to tell him about the CD and drugs I had found. I guess I never really knew her. The woman I thought I had married would never have done something like that. You don't know how lucky you are to have a woman like Renee. Actually, I do. Not a day goes by that I don't thank my lucky stars that she chose me to love. She's a beautiful woman, and I know guys hit on her, but I have always trusted her to do the right thing. Now, if I just get her boss to stop hitting on her," James said with seeming seriousness. Just as I was taking a drink, I couldn't help but splutter at his statement, spitting my drink down my front. My head swiveled to look at him. "Jesus, James, you don't think I would never make a pass at Renee?" I coked out. I then noticed the mirth in his eyes, and he burst out laughing. "Relax, buddy. Renee tells me everything about your relationship. That's why she enjoys working for you so much. You treat her with total respect, and she knows you would never do anything to abuse her respect for you," James said. I grinned back at him. "Yeah, well, it's a rule I've always lived by. Not only have I never made a play for a married woman, I won't even make one if I know the woman has a boyfriend. If you were able to take a woman away from the man she was with, how could you ever trust her not to do the same thing with the next guy that came along? That's even more true now that it's happened to me. One other thing that happened as a result of me finding the disc left behind by my wife is that at the meeting with the therapist following my discovery, she obviously could tell that something dramatic had happened. She asked to see me the following day without Katie. I must say, Dr. Walters knew her business. It didn't take her long to ferret out of me what had happened, and the next thing I knew, I was having one-on-one sessions with her. It took a couple of months for her to make me realize that I had been suppressing many of my true feelings, and another couple of months to help me come to terms with them. In the end, she had truly helped both Katie and me to get past this ordeal. When a year had gone by, Shelley put forth my petition for divorce. We had no reason to present the CD movie as Rhonda's desertion of her family and failure to make any contact with her daughter or me was seen as justifiable cause to grant the divorce and give me sole custody of my daughter. I still kept the movie hidden away as insurance in case Rhonda ever did return and counterfile for custody. Just when things seemed to have settled out for everyone, came the next tragedy in our lives. James was an avid cyclist and even rode in amateur races. During a race, there had been a pile-up, and James had suffered a deep thigh bruise. What no one knew at the time was that he had developed a blood clot which broke loose and lodged in his brain, causing a massive stroke. When it happened, we were at work. I was sitting in my office reviewing the plans for a new house I was getting ready to build when the phone call came. I heard Renee answer the phone. Suddenly, I heard her cry out, and I rushed out to her side. She had a frantic look as she stared at me. "It's James." "They've rushed him to the hospital," she blurted out as she stood and grabbed her purse. She started to run out of the office, and I chased after her. "Come on, get in my truck." "I'll drive," I said when I caught up with her. At first, she gave me a blank stare, then nodded and let me lead her. I put her in the passenger side and hurried to get behind the wheel. Except for telling me which hospital, she never said another word for the rest of the ride. Whenever I would glance over at her, I could see her shaking with worry. When we reached the hospital, I pulled up in front of the emergency admittance, and she leapt from the truck and rushed in. I hurriedly found a parking spot and ran back to the doors. When I went inside, I saw that Renee had already inquired about James, and she was clearly distraught. I went to her, and she looked at me and told me that the doctors were working on James and they didn't know anything yet. I put my arm around her and led her over to the waiting area and sat with her. After a half hour, I realized that it was getting close to time to pick up our daughters at school. Not wanting to leave Renee alone, I called Shelley and gave her a brief rundown on what was happening and asked if she could pick up the girls at school and bring them to the hospital. She assured me she would. I then called the school and asked them to have the girls ready to be picked up. Shelley called me just before they arrived, and I told Renee they were here. I went out to meet them and asked Shelley to take Katie with her and keep Renee company while I talked with Jay. I took her to a quiet spot and as gently as possible told her that her father had been brought to the hospital and was in the emergency room with the doctors. I let her know that it was apparently serious, but we would have to wait for the doctors until we knew how bad it was. Jay did her best to put on a brave face and followed me back to the waiting room. I thanked Shell for her help, and before she left, I promised to call her if we needed her help again. For the next half hour, we sat in silence, me hugging Katie and Renee holding Jeannie. Finally, a nurse came out and asked us to follow her and led us to a private sitting room. Soon we were joined by a doctor. The news was not good. Even though James was still alive, he was being kept that way by life support. Renee collapsed in tears, and I held her in my arms as she sobbed. We continued to wait until they had James placed into ICU, and then Renee and Jay were allowed to see him. After some time had passed, Renee and Jay came back out. "Steve, would you look after Jay for me?" "I'm going to stay here," Renee asked me. Jay started to protest, so I knelt in front of her. "Sweetie, you need to be strong for your mother right now. You come home with Katie and me, and I will bring you back in the morning. If anything happens, your mother will call us, okay?" With tears falling from her eyes, Jay nodded her head. She hugged her mother and then went to hold hands with Katie. I gave Renee a hug and told her to call me if anything changed and that I would see her in the morning. That evening was tough. Both girls hardly ate anything and were quiet, hardly speaking. I got them to bed and then turned to myself, but sleep was hard to come by. The next morning, I woke the girls and pretty much had to force them to eat breakfast. When I told Katie that I was going to drop her off at school, she almost went ballistic. I took her to the side, away from Jay. "Honey, please, I need you to listen to me right now. Jay is going to need to be with her mom. The time is going to come when she needs you, and that's when you will be there for her, okay?" "All right, Dad, I understand," Katie replied. I could tell she wasn't happy about it. "That's my girl," I said, giving her a hug. After dropping Katie off, I took Jeannie by her house. She used her key to let us in, and I had her pack her mother some fresh clothes and anything else she felt her mother might need. When we arrived at the room James was in, we found Renee asleep in a chair beside his bed. I sat down the overnight bag we had brought, and Jeannie and I went back out to the waiting room so her mother could sleep. It was another hour and a half before a haggard Renee came out looking for us. Jay and I hugged her, and then I led her to the cafeteria and bought her some breakfast. It took a bit of prodding to get her to eat, but her lack of appetite was understandable. When she was finished, I went to the desk on the floor and asked if there was somewhere that Renee could shower and change. The nurse was sympathetic under the circumstances and took her to the nurse's locker room. She returned looking somewhat better. The rest of the day was spent with Renee and Jay taking turns sitting with James while I stayed in the waiting area, consoling with Chev was not in there. The doctors came back a little after noon and ran another battery of tests. The prognosis was not good. When it was time for school to let out, I went and picked up Katie, and we returned to the hospital until late evening when I again took the girls home. It was 5:30 in the morning when my phone rang. I knew before I even answered it. I heard Renee, obviously crying, on the other end, tell me that James had passed. I could only tell her how sorry I was and that the girls and I would be there as soon as possible. I quickly dressed and made my way to Katie's bedroom. The girls were asleep in her bed. I gently woke Katie and put my finger to her lips before she could speak and beckoned her to follow me. I told her that her friend's father had died, and she began to cry. I pulled her into a hug. "Honey, Jay is going to need your support now. I need you to hurry and get dressed while I talk with her. When you're ready, she will probably need your help getting dressed. We need to get to the hospital for Renee." Katie looked at me and nodded, wiping the tears from her eyes. "Okay, Dad, I will help her." My daughter suddenly looked more mature than her 14 years, and I was proud of her. I then woke Jeannie, and as difficult as it was, I told her that her father had died. She broke down sobbing, and I held her in my arms for several minutes. I then told her that her mother needed us, and with Katie's help, she was soon dressed, and we were on our way. It was heartbreaking to watch mother and daughter in a sobbing embrace as they shared their grief. Katie was crying as well and holding tightly to me. She, too, knew what it was like to lose a parent. Soon, I left Katie with Renee and Jay and went to find the hospital administrators. I informed them that we would have a funeral home contact them as soon as we had chosen one. I then gently led Renee and her daughter out to the car and drove them home. Once there, I settled them into the den and asked her what phone calls needed to be made. She gave me a list of people to call, including her parents and James' brother. Like me, James' parents had already passed away, and his brother was his only relative. I also called Keith and Shelley. On my recommendation, James and Renee had chosen to use Shelley as their family lawyer. They dropped everything and came over right away. Shelley stayed with Renee while I made the phone calls, including arranging with a funeral home to take charge of James's remains. The toll of her loss and the lack of sleep finally overcame Renee, and with Shelley's help, she was put to bed. Afterward, I talked with Shelley. She told me that she would handle the estate matters pro bono and that she had a copy of James's will. She also let me know that they will be referred to 2 burial plots that James had purchased. I thanked Keith and Shelley for coming, and when they had left, I set about fixing lunch for the girls. The rest of the day was quiet, with bouts of tears from both Jay and Katie. The emotional toll soon overcame both girls, and as soon as dinner was over, they both turned in. Jay didn't want to sleep alone, so once more, both girls slept in the same bed. I decided to stay in the guest room, and after I had locked up for the night, I, too, felt the drain of energy and went to bed. I was tired enough that I slept through the night. I awoke around 6 and quickly dressed, but I realized that I was not the first up as I was met by the smell of coffee as I stepped out of the room. I walked to the kitchen where Renee was sitting at the table. She started and gasped when I walked in. "Steve, I didn't realize you were still here." "Well, Jeannie wanted Katie to stay with her, and I decided to stay in your guest room just in case," I replied. I didn't say just in case what, but Renee knew what I meant. I told her about the arrangements that had been made with the funeral home, and I told her that I would pick up her parents at the airport as they were flying in today. She thanked me for everything I had done. When our daughters finally appeared, I told Renee to remain seated, and I made breakfast for everyone. Once I had the kitchen cleaned, it was time to leave for the airport. I arrived early enough to be waiting at arrivals when they came out. I had no trouble recognizing them as I had seen their pictures at Renee's house. "Mr. and Mrs. Hanley, I'm Steve Connor, Renee's boss," I said, holding out my hand. "It's nice to meet you, Steve. Please call me Dan, and this is my wife Victoria. I feel as if I almost know you. Our daughter often speaks of you when we talk." "She regards you very highly," Renee's father said, shaking my hand. "The feelings are mutual. I couldn't accomplish what I do without her help. Both she and James have become dear friends. I just wish we were meeting under better circumstances," I replied. Renee's mother gave me a hug. I liked both of them immediately. We gathered their luggage and loaded it into the car, and I drove them to their daughter's home. It was a bittersweet reunion, and more tears were shed. Katie and I stayed for lunch before taking our leave. James's funeral was held on Friday. His brother was there, as well as many of James's friends. He had been quite popular due to his easygoing ways and quick humor. I was also pleased to see that many of the subcontractors who had worked for me over the years and had gotten to know Renee showed up to pay their respects. Renee's parents stayed for another 2 days, and on Sunday, they invited Katie and me over for lunch. After lunch, we adults went into the living room while Katie went to her room. We had been talking about everyday mundane things until Renee's mother spoke up. "Honey, do you know what your plans are now? You know we would love to have you move back home," Victoria said to her daughter. "I know, Mom. You and Dad have always been there to support me, and I love you for that. But this has all been so sudden that Jay and I are going to need some time to decide what we are going to do," Renee replied. Until now, I hadn't thought about the possibility that Renee might move away, and that sudden realization gave me a hollow feeling in the pit of my stomach. And yet, as her friend, I would support whatever she decided. I stayed until a little after 5 and before leaving took Renee aside. "I know you need time to mourn and to think about your life now. I want you to take all the time you need. Don't worry about work, and if you do decide to move back with your parents, I want you to know I will support your decision. You have to do what's best for you and Jeannie now. In the meantime, if you need anything at all, please call. I'll always be here for you," I said. Renee teared up and gave me a hug. "Thank you, Steve. I don't think I would have made it this far without you." Renee's father followed Katie and me out to the car, and after I had her belted, he stuck his hand out to me. "Steve, Renee has told me how much you have done for her and Jeannie through all this. I want you to know how much Victoria and I appreciate it. I shudder to think how much worse it would have been without your support." I shook his hand. "Dan, it's the least that I could do." She and James and Jay were there for me and Katie after my wife left and abandoned our daughter. It was their love that really brought my daughter out of her depression. As long as she remains here, you can rely on me to look after them the best I can. Over the next 2 weeks, Katie and I would stop by to check on Renee and Jay. She never mentioned if she had decided what she was going to do with her future, and I was content not to pry and give her time. Jay stayed home with her mother for the first week following the funeral and then returned to school. It was Monday a week later that I went into the office and saw her car parked outside. She was sitting at her desk when I walked in. I knew she had reached a decision. I just stood staring at her, waiting for her to speak. "Well, boss, are you going to show me what all you messed up the last couple of weeks so I can fix it?" she asked. Does this mean I left it there, not daring to finish the question? Yes, it means we're staying. This is Jay's home, and all her friends are here. I think it would make this even harder for her to make her move. Besides, we both know you need me to keep your business running, she said, giving me a smile with the last sentence. I exhaled, not even realizing I had been holding my breath. You sure know how to butter up your boss, I said with a big grin on my face. With that said, I caught her up on the last 2 weeks' events, and then she kicked me out of the office, telling me to keep an eye on the subcontractors. I don't think the smile left my face all day. Over the next year, it seemed that we spent almost every weekend together. Due to our daughter's friendship, Renee and I would attend the girls' sporting events and other school activities together. If they didn't have school events, the girls would usually come to my house. I always made sure that Renee would come too. I didn't want her sitting around feeling depressed. Our friendship continued to grow to the point that there was nothing we couldn't speak to each other about. As for Katie, Renee had become a surrogate mother to whom she could talk about things that a young teen girl would be embarrassed to talk to her father about. I guess I also became a father figure to Jay as well. Of course, when it came to being a disciplinarian figure, the girls would usually just giggle at me, and it would have to be Renee who stepped in. Both girls knew they had me wrapped around their little fingers. The nice thing is that they were both good girls, and we rarely denied them anything. It was a Saturday just a little over a year after James had passed away. I had run over to one of the houses I had under construction to handle a small crisis. When I got back home, I saw Renee's car in the driveway. We had planned a barbecue and a day of lounging around the pool. When I came into the house, I could hear the girls laughing and giggling out back, so I went to the laundry room and got my swim trunks where I had left them to dry. Normally, I would change in my bedroom, but today I figured I would just slip into the downstairs bathroom with the suit in hand. I opened the door, and my eyes went wide. Standing in front of me was Renee. She was just reaching for her bikini top and was only wearing a skimpy pair of panties. I couldn't help but stare at her body. Of course, I had seen her in a bikini before, but never like this. Her body was perfect. I know I only stood there for a couple of seconds, but it seemed much longer. Renee gasped and crossed her arms across her chest. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," I stuttered. I quickly turned and pulled the door shut behind me and rushed to the living room. I was totally flustered. I remember thinking that I hoped I hadn't ruined our friendship and that she didn't hate me. 10 minutes passed before Renee came out wearing her bikini. I know she could see how ashamed I looked. "Renee, I am sorry. I heard the girls out by the pool and thought you were out there too. I really didn't mean to walk in on you," I spoke in a rush. She stood in front of me, trying to look mad. That lasted all of about 10 seconds until she laughed. She walked over to me and patted my cheek. "Steve, I know you would never do that intentionally. It's okay, don't worry about it. Now go get changed and put the chicken on the grill, I'm hungry," she said. With that, she turned and headed for the pool as I stood with my mouth hanging open, watching her leave. I let out a sigh of relief that she wasn't mad at me. Of course, I hurried and did as she asked. I went out back and saw Renee sipping wine while the girls romped in the pool. I grilled the chicken, trying to keep myself from staring at her. I couldn't get the image of her in the bathroom out of my mind. After we had eaten, we sat in recliners, getting some sun. By now, we were talking again as we always had. The only other thing that happened was that during a lull in the conversation, Renee looked at me and smirked. I know I must have blushed. The sun was setting when they left. Jay had invited Katie to spend the night, so she went with them. As the girls headed to the car, Renee came and gave me a kiss on the cheek and another sly grin. I breathed a sigh of relief when they had gone. At least my faux pas had not ruined our friendship. I went into my home office and went over some paperwork before turning in for the night. It was only when I was in bed that my mind returned to the event earlier in the day. I could see her standing practically naked in front of me. That image caused my emotions to stir. I reached down and felt myself start to get hard. This was the first time I had an erection since my wife left me. I guess what makes that remarkable in itself was that until then, I had a very high sex drive. I always thought I was abnormal, as I seemed to have a perpetual hard-on and spent most of my time trying to get into my wife's holes. I knew that the reason my ex had left wasn't due to a lack of sex. I was nervous when I went to pick up Katie on Sunday afternoon because I thought she might see what I had done with my own eyes. I'm sure she just assumed I was still ashamed of what had happened the day before, because that's what I realized afterward. I had a confused week the following one. She was the one I would always find myself staring at in the office. I was unable to comprehend my emotions. I hadn't felt the need to be around or with a woman for the previous 2 years. Renee was my friend, not a woman, and she didn't count. I consequently spent a lot of time away from the office and at the construction sites. The following Saturday, 2 things were taking place. Renee and I were dropping our daughters off at a girls' 2-week sleepaway sports camp. That was the first thing. The second was that the annual awards night of the local building association, of which I was a member, was approaching. It took place in one of the town's hotel's ballrooms. There would be dinner, award presentations in a number of categories, and dancing on the dance floor thereafter. Renee and I were going. The girls were so happy when we dropped them off at the camp on Saturday morning that they nearly forgot to say goodbye. Renee and I laughed at that. I told her I would pick her up at 6 o'clock as I dropped her off at her house and headed back home. In an effort to distract myself from things I didn't want to think about, I worked in the garden all day. I knocked on Renee's door at precisely 6 o'clock, and when she opened it, I was in complete shock. She was wearing a little black dress that was erotically pleasing but not garish. She wore black stockings, black high heels, and a pearl necklace. "You are so beautiful," I stumbled and said. This made me grin broadly. "Why, thank you, kind sir." As usual for 2 close friends, our conversation was light-hearted and unaffected, even though I was tempted to look directly at her. 3 other builders and their spouses sat at a table with us. Like me, they were spec builders. Most of the conversation around the table was shop talk. There was fish or chicken for dinner, and it was actually pretty good, which is unusual for one of these gatherings. Subsequently, we focused on the dais while the winners were declared. Renee leaped from her seat with delight when my name was called and the award for quality of product was announced. My acceptance speech was brief. This award belongs to Renee as much as it does to the association. Without her tireless efforts to keep me on track, I wouldn't be here today. She said, tears welling up in her eyes, as we hugged, and she even gave me a surprise kiss on the lips when I got back to our table. We had never kissed on anything other than the cheek before, so it wasn't particularly sensual. I experienced a sharp spike in adrenaline. The dance floor was cleared after the awards were presented. After accepting the congrats from numerous colleagues in the industry, I asked Renee if she wanted to dance. After she said yes to my invitation, we made our way to the dance floor. We danced to a fast song for our first dance. Even though I'm not much of a dancer, she was like poetry in motion, and I couldn't take my eyes off of her. I was about to lead her back to the table during the slow song that followed when she slid into my arms and wrapped her arms around my neck. We started to sway to the music as I put my arms around her waist without resisting. I hadn't held a woman in more than 2 years, so when I held this one, I felt movement down my pants right away. She wouldn't let me back down, even though I tried to. All I could hope was that she was unaware of her impact on me. I let her go ahead of me back to the table when the song ended, hoping no one would notice the bulge in my pants. After Renee finished her wine glass, she turned to face me and said, "Steve, I think a perfect way to end this evening would be to go back to your house for a soak in the hot tub." I quickly agreed because I didn't want the evening to end and I didn't want to take Renee home. On the way home, we discussed the award and its potential benefits for the company. I had all the newest remote technology installed when I had my house built. I could use my phone to manage the lighting, air conditioning, and heating. The hot tub was preheated when we got there because I could turn it on in the same manner. Renee and Jay had taken to leaving their swimsuits at my pool since they used to spend a lot of time there when the weather allowed. I got our suits, and I changed into mine in the laundry room while she went to change in the restroom. I went ahead and got 2 glasses and a bottle of wine and started to wait for her. The sight of her leaving in her bikini was enough to make me swell again, so I was relieved to be in the tub under the bubbles already. I held out a glass of wine to her, and she slid into the water. We stayed in the warm water and didn't say anything for 10 minutes. She was the one to break the quiet first. "Steve, it's been more than 2 years since Rhonda left you. Have you considered dating someone new?" I admit that I flashed at the question, hoping that the darkness would hide it from her. I refused to tell my friend lies. The truth is that until very recently, I haven't even thought about it. I guess I was pretty scarred over what happened. "You said until recently. Has something happened to change your thoughts?" she inquired. "No, I am aware that my face was very red." "Well, I stammered out. I glanced at her, and even in the dim light, her face had a cunning smile on it. I watched as she put down her glass and reached behind her back. Then, propelled by the bubbles to the top of the water, her bikini top left me sitting dumbfounded. She got up enough so that the water did not cover her breasts. "Oh God, Renee," I groaned as my tool tugged at my swimsuit. Was it seeing me like this? She glided through the water to land in my lap, facing me. She then spread her legs wide to sit straddling my legs. She wrapped her arms around my neck. "Stephen, when James died, I didn't think I would ever have feelings for anyone again. When he was alive, we did talk about what would happen if either one of us passed on, and we both agreed that we would never want the other to spend their life in grief. I will always love James, but I have come to realize that there can be room in my heart for another." For a moment, we looked each other in the gazes. With concern, she said, "Steve? Say something. Am I making a fool of myself?" I ended my quiet. We found ourselves locked in a deep kiss as she said, "No, you're not. I have been fighting my feelings for you. I was afraid to lose your friendship if I let you know." That night, we had ferocious, passionate sex. We fell asleep in each other's arms after we were finished. "Good morning, lovely," I uttered. "Good morning, stud," she chuckled and said. She reached over, touched my morning wood, gave it a gentle pat. I smiled and asked, "Are you always hard like this?" She said with a menacing smile, "What can I say? I've always had a very high sex drive, and you just bring it out of me even more." She turned me onto my back before straddling me. She continued at a leisurely pace for almost 10 minutes. She squeaked then and started to really screw me. She purred with pleasure as I stroked her back after I had put my arms around her. When at last she admitted to me that she was hungry, we jumped out of bed, had a quick shower, and made our way to the kitchen. I quickly made 2 Denver omelets for us and watched with a hidden smile as she devoured them. We took our coffee and went to sit on the back deck for a while after cleaning up the kitchen. We simply sat there and enjoyed each other's company in silence. Without warning, she questioned, "Did you mean it, Steve?" I was somewhat perplexed. "That my heart now belongs to you," she said, blushing cutely. "Did I mean what, honey?" "Renee, we have known each other for 7 years now. For the first 5, you became my right hand, the person who I depended on. 2 years ago, you became so much more. When you took me and Katie under your wing to help us through a hard time, now in the last year, you have also become the dearest and closest friend I've ever had. Now I know that I cannot deny it. I not only love you as a friend, but I am head over heels in love with you. So, the answer to your question is yes. I want you to belong to me. But more than that, I want all of you to belong to me, especially your heart. I want to belong to you 100%, my heart and my soul." Her eyes started to well up with tears when I had finished speaking. I initially believed that I had erred in telling her the truth from my heart. Up until she leaped onto my lap and gave me an intense kiss. We spent the rest of that Sunday making love whenever and wherever in the house the time was right. "I love you too, darling. I want us to belong to each other, and I promise you that I am all yours." We got up together on Monday morning, took a shower, and went to her place to change into new clothes before going to work. She was fixing coffee when I reviewed the paperwork for the day. I kissed her goodbye and went off to visit the 3 houses we were working on. I went back to the office to have lunch with Renee after getting some takeout Chinese. I began updating her on the status of the construction after we were done. That day, after work, Renee and I returned to her house, where she packed a suitcase to be delivered to my house. We both knew she would be staying with me for the next 2 weeks while the girls were at camp, so we never even brought it up. Even though we only made love a few times in the office, those 2 weeks were jam-packed with it. It was fun, you know, bending her over my desk and plowing her fields for her. At last, we had to discuss the future on Friday, the day before we were to pick up the girls. We decided that the girls' opinions and desires were more important than our own, even though we also agreed that we didn't want to live apart and that she would be willing to move into my house. We then decided that after we picked up the girls, I would drop her and Jeannie off at their house, take Katie home, and we would each discuss it with our daughters. As for me, I thought that Renee and Jay moving in with us would be fine with Katie. Renee had become Jay's mother in all but name, the 2 of them were already as close as sisters. The true concern I had was Jay's reaction. I was worried that she would think we were disrespecting her father's legacy. We had agreed that, should one or both of the girls object, we would not live together but would stay committed to one another and wait for their approval or until after they left high school to attend college. After I got home with Katie, I started preparing lunch while she excitedly told me about their camp experience. It was clear that both girls were having a great time. When Katie finally calmed down an hour after our meal, I had the opportunity to speak with her about Renee and myself. "Katie, over the last year, we have spent a lot of time with Renee and Jay. It's like we have become a family," I replied. With a nod in agreement, Katie turned to face me. "Well, while you girls were at camp, Renee and I had a lot of time to talk things over, and we thought that maybe it was time that we actually were one." Katie said, "What does that mean, Daddy?" "It means that I would like to have Renee and Jay come live with us when the time is right. I want to make Renee my wife, but we will only do that if both you and Jay are in agreement with this." With a squeal, Katie leaped to her feet. "Oh, Daddy, I think that would be wonderful. Jay will really be my sister then, and I already love Renee like a mother. I've got to call Jay." "Well, hang on for a minute, Pumpkin. Renee is going to talk to Jay about this. She might not see things the same as you do, so I think it would be best if you wait until we know how she feels about it, okay?" After giving what I had said some thought, Katie smiled sardonically and shrugged her shoulders. "Okay, Daddy, I'll wait." The wait was brief because the house phone rang in less than 20 minutes. I answered right away because caller ID indicated it was Renee. She informed me that Jay was interested in speaking with Katie but would not elaborate. My daughter ran to her bedroom to have a private conversation after I nervously gave her the phone. I'm used to teenagers talking on the phone for extended periods of time, and this one was no different, as time proved. After an hour, my nerves were pretty frayed. Katie bolted out the front door and out of her room. Before I could reach the door, Katie and Jay returned inside. All I could hear was what sounded like happy squealing. The 2 teenagers ran across the room, and 2 vivacious girls embraced me right away. When I looked up, I saw Renee entering the room with 2 suitcases and a smile on her face. The 2 girls separated from me as soon as I was the object of their hugs, ran to Renee, took the suitcases, and went upstairs. My mouth remained open as I stood there, until Renee approached and attempted to force her tongue down my throat. I gave her a kiss back while groaning. When we got up to catch our breath, I said, I take it everything went as well as we could have hoped for. Apparently, our daughters had already talked about this happening and we're all for it. They were just waiting for us to realize we wanted it too, she joked. That evening, we celebrated the union of our families with a dinner out, and on Sunday, we made multiple trips to Renee's house to move the remaining items into their new residence. After talking it over, Renee and I agreed that she would sell her house. She made a nice profit because the real estate market was doing pretty well. I had a better idea, but she offered to have it deposited in a joint account. We saved it in an account for Jay's college expenses. I had the impression that James would be content that he was funding his daughter's education. For the next year, despite living in a home with 3 times as many women as me, life was amazing. It made me happy to make them happy, even though it seemed like they always got their way 99% of the time. They would respect my choice if, in the rare event that I was completely at odds. I also couldn't seem to keep my hands off Renee because my sex drive had returned in full force. She was my woman, for the most part, and would stop at nothing to please me. One major benefit of my award was that I started receiving requests from people asking me to build houses for them. As a result, as my business expanded, I frequently had up to 10 houses under construction at once in order to meet the demands of my workload. We had to hire someone else to handle the office work because Renee preferred working in the field. Since Renee was the most qualified candidate and knew exactly what needed to be done, I let her handle the hiring. The spring after they moved in, Renee and I got married. Our wedding was informal, with only a few close friends invited. Shell was Renee's bridesmaid, and Keith was my best man. I took Renee to Fiji for a week-long honeymoon. We even managed to tear ourselves away from the bedroom to see the sights. It was shortly after we joined our household that Katie began to call Renee Mom. I was happy that they had bonded so well. As for Jay, it wasn't until just after her 17th birthday that she called me Dad for the first time. I don't even remember what it was she wanted, but I vividly remember when I told her okay that she kissed me on the cheek and said thank you Daddy. That simple token brought tears to my eyes, and when I looked at Renee her eyes were glistening with happiness too. Of course, in my mind both Katie and Jay were my daughters, and I loved them equally. As emotional as that was, it was surpassed many times over. A couple of weeks later, Renee was out shopping and I was at home with the girls. When they came in and sat down, I knew from the looks on their faces that something was up, and it looked to be serious. Daddy, I'm your daughter. And you love me, don't you, Katie? Asked. Of course I do, baby, I answered while wondering what I was being set up for. Well, I think that you love Jay like me too, right? She went on. I glanced at Jay right away, and she was obviously uncomfortable, but she was also watching me intently. Why haven't you adopted her so that you can be her father and my sister in real life, given that you both know how much I love you both? As Katie asked, to say I was shocked would be an understatement. I turned to face Jay. She had tears welling up in her eyes, and her chin was trembling. I would, honey, I really would, Daddy. Becoming your legal daughter would be the best thing in the world for me to do. She flew into my open arms when I held them out. Jeannie was on my lap, and we were both crying when Renee arrived home. Katie approached Renee and started whispering in her ear before Renee could inquire what was wrong. Renee quickly dropped her bags and came over. Before she knew it, the 3 of us were crying and giving each other hugs. I noticed that Katie was crying as well, so I extended a hand to her. We had fully bonded as a family that afternoon. Please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and remember to like, share, and subscribe. A rebirth of love and hope had emerged from the ashes of 2 tragedies in the lives of 2 families. Life was pleasant. Please feel free to leave your comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.